I sort of planned to work out what I was going to say in the sort of pre-period, and then I ended up chatting to people.
Yeah, and I went to go to what I would also remember what I'm planning to say.
You've got notes though, that's very professional. Harry. Okay, that sounds okay. How big of a fish tank? You're talking bluebird?
No.
Okay, that sounds reasonable.
How's Teddy? Cheer up.
Yeah, he's good, yeah. What about the lights?
It can't be, the shot is set
People can't see me?
Yeah, sorry.
Who wants to see me? Can I sit on the stage? No? Like,
Sorry.
okay. My sister's supposed to be coming and hasn't shown up. What a dick. It's a risk. Yeah. It's a bit of a distance, yeah. No? I don't know. I feel like if you opened a Marks and Spencer's or something, we'd have a crowd like this. Is there? Where is it?
I go to those slippers. I go, it's in that place where there's some
Oh, yeah. Isn't that just a M&S? I'm mostly stalling for time so I can work out what I'm going to say. Whenever I'm ready. Trying to be like David, carrying it around here everywhere I go. What do you think? Come in? Hello. Excellent. The microphone's on. That's good news. Thank you everybody for being here. This is incredibly exciting. It's lovely to see you all, even though I can't really see you because there's bright lights in my face, but it's a turn of phrase. So thank you very much for coming here for what is nominally the launch of this book, which is called, and he looks at it as if having edited to make sure he gets the title right, Behavioural Public Policy in a Global Context, Practical Lessons from Outside the Nudge Unit. It is very unlikely that any of you will ever see another copy of this book again, because it is ridiculously expensive. However, If anybody was looking to find some sort of illicit copy, then my email address is michael.peterscience@ksal.ac.uk. And I have the ability to email people, and of course, if my publishers asked, I would never do that. So thank you ever so much for being here. I'm going to talk for as brief a period of time as possible before introducing other people who are much more interesting and exciting than me. In fact, that's the entire reason for this book existing. The reason we wrote this book, the reason we edited this book, in fact, didn't write it, edited it, very important distinction. Oh, that was a nasty noise. I'll try not to make that one again. Not entirely sure it was my gift. So, over the last 15 years, since the publication of Nudge, we have seen this amazing expansion and explosion, if you will, in the use of behavioural science to try and influence public policy. And it's very exciting. You can read reports by the World Bank that says 102 countries and 150 countries have got nudge units. It's very exciting. It's very interesting. All of the narrative about it, all of it is focused on the experiences of a very small number of people who look and sound quite a lot like me, and who work at a place quite like the place that I used to work. I'm not going to name names because you all know who they are, right? Because some of them rhyme with David Balpin. And those stories are very interesting and very important. However, they miss the detail of what's happening all around the world. They miss most of what's exciting about behavioural science now, which is not what a bunch of old white guys are doing, but what a bunch of other people are doing. People who are much more thoughtful, more interesting, more creative, dare I say, more diverse than those of us who I was just referencing. And their voices get lost, and that's really a shame. The other thing, which I feel we wanted to inject with this book, is a sense of positivity. If you Google behavioural science on any given day, or you look on Twitter, go on Twitter and search Francesca Gino or Dan Ariely, what you'll find is fraud and scandal and people lying about lying. Like, how did we not see it coming? These people who were outrageous villains, all the time talking about how villainous they were. It turns out they were the baddies. And this can give you a very negative view of academic behavioural science, or behavioural science generally. It can cause you to ask in long reads in the New York Times, is Nudge dead because of these people who are committing fraud? And talking to people who are actually doing behavioural insights in the real world, people in this country, in other countries, and governments all over, that's not really the picture you get. What you see is dedicated people who want to make the world a better place, who have been pre-registering their trial protocols since before it was cool, who've been conducting rigorous analysis and having somebody else check their code after it was done. People who are being thoughtful and really addressing meaningful questions. And who are doing really good quality research, often, with the greatest respect to my academic colleagues, often better research than we are doing in academia, because we are slightly incentivized to ask questions like, I wonder if networking makes people feel dirty, and not questions like, I wonder if we can reduce overprescribing of antibiotics by general practitioners and hence avoid some of the 10 millions of death we're going to have as a result of antimicrobial resistance in 50 years' time. So academia incentivizes to focus often on the trivial. So this book is about drawing out a range of diverse voices from around the world, doing behavioural insights at all levels of government and outside of it, to try and understand their stories, understand where we're going. Not just from people like me, but from people who are younger, more interesting, and who I think represent the next wave. Over the course of the next however long we're going to be talking for, we're going to be hearing from some of those people who are doing interesting things. We're also going to be hearing from one of the few exceptions to my universal hatred of academics, Adam Oliver, who is generally a very thoughtful and interesting person, and therefore is a much better person to talk to this topic than me. So, we have two videos from colleagues who can't be here, so it's kind of like This Is Your Life. I don't know what the modern reference of that is. Anyway, so we're going to play those, and then we're going to go into the rest of our speakers, and it's going to be really exciting. Is everybody ready for that? Everybody sick of me? Yes? Excellent. And then magic should happen.
Hey everyone, this is Syon Bhanot. I'm an associate professor at Swarthmore College and the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and one of the co-editors of the book that we're gathered here today to celebrate. My apologies in advance, of course, for not being able to attend in person. London is far away from Philadelphia, but also teaching obligations at this time, so I can't join live, but I'm happy to be able to talk to you guys through this recording. So I wanted to sort of do this in two parts, give you some of my reflections on editing the volume, and then just a little bit about a chapter within the volume that I co-authored with Suzanne Schwartz and Anjali Chainani about the team in Philadelphia. So big picture, editing the volume was an absolute pleasure. My main takeaways are things that I sort of learned from the experience. First, there's so much going on in behavioral science and policy. I mean, we could have had 3 times as many chapters as we did have. And there's already folks who are kind of saying, why did you incorporate us? Why didn't you incorporate us? Well, because the book is fat enough as it is, maybe there'll be time in a future volume. But it also struck me in reviewing the chapters and thinking more about what's been going on in the field, that we're sort of at an inflection point. I know it's kind of cliche to talk about going beyond nudging, but I do think that's kind of where we are as a community. And I often think about, and did while editing the volume, how people will look back on this time and look back on the work that a large number of individuals did in applying behavioral science ideas to public policy. And I really hope that we can play a formative role in solving big problems. So my hope is that people don't look back on this time and the coming few decades and say, well, there were a lot of people who got caught up in this behavioral science thing and they got really good at solving little problems in modest ways, but kind of look back and saw this as the start of a bigger wave of behavioral science kind of being integrated more into policymaking processes and being used to tackle the really big problems and really integrate these ideas of non-rational decision making, treating people as they are rather than as they normatively should be, and really sort of view that as what the contribution was, and sort of reshaping the way that we think about how people make decisions and how that kind of aggregates up to policy outcomes. And then the final point about co-editing is just to give flowers, so to speak, to Michael Sanders and Shibeal and Flaherty, who are really amongst the hardest working and most talented people in this space. So it was a real privilege to be able to work with them, particularly because I had a baby during the time of co-editing this work, or my wife and I had a child. So I wasn't always quite as attentive to the emails as Michael and particularly Shibeal were. So I appreciate their willingness to fill in for me when I was doing bottle feeding and whatnot. But I also want to say a quick word about PBSI, so the Philadelphia Behavioral Science Initiative. We did a chapter together in the book, myself, Suzanne Schwartz, and Anjali Chainani. And I think this was a unique example here in the city of Philadelphia, where it was a sort of partnership between academics and policymakers that was really sort of organic and not funded, and it was sort of driven by academics who wanted to engage in policy work and use behavioral science to do so, and policymakers who were willing and open, and departments that were willing and open. I don't know if there's a lot of similar models. A lot of the other models involve big staffs and funding and foundations, etc. Ours was really academics, policymakers meeting for coffee and saying, "Hey, we should join forces here. There's benefits for everyone." So I think that's worked really well, but I don't know if it's necessarily replicable. You really do need a unique set of academically minded people who are flexible in their interests. I think flexibility was crucial. We couldn't do all the RCTs that we wanted to do. We couldn't focus on the areas of interest that were interesting to the academics involved. We had to sort of be more adaptable and look at outcomes that policymakers cared about, even though academics might not find it as interesting. So I think if you have that, if you have those academics who are more flexible in their thinking, and you have policymakers who are willing to engage and willing to get outside their comfort zone, I think that model can work well. It's also the case, and this can also be a big picture reflection, that there's a lot of overlap increasingly between the behavioral science integrating into policy work with data science and evidence-based policy. That's clearly a trend that's happening, and I think we should sort of lean into that trend in the sense that if we want to have those bigger impacts beyond just sort of beneficial, cost-effective nudges at a smaller scale, we do need to think about how we can evolve our own work to getting a little bit beyond the sort of behavioral science constraints, in a sense, and really thinking more about how we can really bring more of our applied econometric toolkits, our work with data, thinking about quasi-random evaluations as well, to really make sure that we can sort of maximize our collective impact. So thank you so much for listening, and again, apologies for not being able to join in person. I hope you have a wonderful event. I'm looking forward to meeting many of you in person at some point soon.
Hey everyone, my name is Vanessa Gianais and I'm a researcher in the experimental government team here at King's, led by Michael Sanders. Congratulations to Michael, Syon, and Shibeal on the launch of this terrific book, and my sincere apologies that I don't get to be there in person tonight. In fact, I'm currently recording this from Freetown, Sierra Leone, which coincidentally somewhat relates to tonight's topic and brings me full circle in my own personal journey within the field. So I will use this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about that and why I think it is so important for this book to be out there in the world. I'm a social psychologist by training, but long before becoming aware of the existence of the field of behavioral science and all the applications of psychology and psychological interventions, I was an activist. For as long as I can remember, I've been extremely passionate about fighting local and global inequalities. But having started my academic journey in Germany, where nudging, boosting, behavior change more broadly are arguably not or not yet as popular and established of ways to bring upon positive change in society, meant that for a while I was not quite sure how I could apply and utilize psychological and other tools and instruments to improve outcomes, especially for those who find themselves structurally disadvantaged in any way. After my studies, I spent some time working in development and working with vulnerable populations across Latin America and the Caribbean, but especially given my background, became unsatisfied with the lack of rigor in finding out what works, what doesn't, what is helpful, and what is harmful. Fast forward a few years, including a master's in the UK, introducing me to the applied social sciences and a fellowship program which I was able to utilize to spend some time in some of the nudge units spotlighted in this very book. During that time, I worked with the Behavioural Insights Team. I spent some time with Innovations for Poverty Action here in Freetown. I became a consultant for the Mind, Behavior and Development Unit at the World Bank and collaborated with colleagues at HBS and Basara on some of my favorite trials to date to have been involved with. It is truly a joy to see so many familiar names on the authors list and to learn so much about the work of the many other teams globally that are doing such important work, but who, until now, may have come short in receiving the flowers for their incredible contributions. The behavioral sciences suffer from a lack of diversity on all fronts, so to have a book amplifying global perspectives, use cases, learnings, and success stories is so important. I selfishly wish this book would have existed about 4 years ago when I started digging for ways on how to marry theory and practice in a quest to figure out my own purpose, but I'm absolutely thrilled that it does now and that you all get to hear about it and discuss it tonight. I'm looking forward to building an even bigger and more diverse network in our field, and I hope you have the most wonderful time brainstorming ways on how to do that successfully. I wish you all the best for tonight, and I hope to see many of you soon.
Excellent. So we will now, after 2 videos, turn to people who are actually here in the room, which is exciting in its own way. We'll ask everybody to speak, and then we will do this. You can ask all the questions you'd like, conditional on them being short and fitting in the time, after we've done that. So I'm first going to introduce one of my favourite people in the entire world, Lucy Makinson, who is the head of policy at the Behavioural Insights Team. It's a very exciting job title, but she's brilliant. She's going to talk now.
No pressure after that introduction. So I was given the sort of where do we go next in behavioural science and policy. So I started by trying to think about where we are now. And I think where we are now is kind of, there's a couple of different sort of evolutions of nudge. So we've got loads that we're doing in what people think of as the very classic nudge. So we can send people better text messages, they get more vaccines. You know, you're like 101 stuff. And then I think you've got a little bit of what at some point certainly in bit internally was called, BI 2.0, and that was not just how do we work with system 1, but how do we engage system 2. So if we want somebody to stop speeding, how do we prompt a moment of reflection so you're not just changing their behavior in that moment, but you're changing it in the future. And that is kind of, I would say, the bog standard behavioral science offering, or has been historically. And then I think where we're seeing kind of really big shifts in the scale and scope of this, it's when it goes up into sort of policy level. So pension, auto-enrollment, I think broadly resounding success, although there may be some debate on that. And similarly, sort of sugar tax. So broadly speaking, third of sugar cut from drinks, pretty good thing. So that feels to me definitely like an area that we want to be doing more on. And I think one of the things is the scale of the impact. I think the other one is there's just a reasonable amount of low-hanging fruit. So if you look at the sort of behavioural science, skeptics would look at both of those and go, well, obviously they would succeed. Auto-enrollment, defaults, that's like the most stable behavioural science you can get. Anybody who was working in this field wouldn't have been shocked by it. Although some people working in the policy space were definitely shocked by the scale of the impact. But to me, that's almost the point, that there's a lot that's sitting within the policy world that hasn't really been touched by behavioural science because people weren't thinking in that way. They weren't thinking about that's how we apply it. I think the challenge that we now have is sort of how do you scale that up and get it being thought of? And I think part of the problem is we are only being involved, and I say we as sort of broad unit of behavioural practitioners, including those units existing in government, are only getting involved in questions that they are being asked to answer. And what that leaves is a lot of the low-hanging fruit not even being touched, because the kind of questions they're trying to answer are not what we've been training them to answer. So we've been teaching, actually you need a very clear target behaviour and then we can come in and change that behaviour. But that's not how the sugar tax worked. The sugar tax worked by saying, what is it that is driving people to be overweight? How do we change the fundamental food environment? But there wasn't a simple question like, how do we stop them choosing that meal over the other in quite the same way? And so that, to a certain extent, means that we need to kind of get in the room. We're missing things. I think one of my favourites on this is, you know, universal credit being paid out monthly. Basically, anybody in the behavioural science space is like, you should give people the option of paying it weekly. They do in Scotland. It's not difficult. You could. And there's pretty good evidence that that would help people to budget and they could opt into it. Why wouldn't you? But that isn't happening because that conversation isn't even taking place in the first place. And I think we're only going to kind of get there if we can fundamentally start upskilling across the board so that it isn't just the expertise that sits in behavioural science practitioners, but that it scales up across organisations so that people might not be exactly who's designing that, but they know the right questions to ask and they see the scope of kind of behavioural science and where it could sit. And I think exactly what's been talked about in this book is kind of how do you spread this across organisations and get that to pick up. So I think that's one of the sort of big challenges that we're going to be facing. And then I guess, so just sort of finally, like, how do we actually get there? We want it to spread within organisations. Now, part of that, hopefully, will come over time, that you've just got a bunch of people that have worked on behavioural science projects and eventually that that skill is going to build up across government, but it's going to be a really, really slow grind to get there. I think the other thing is about how do you build this into systems, right? The real success of things like pensions, things like sugar tax, is that they're dealing with things at the system level rather than the individual level. And what they show is that you can nudge all you like. What you need to do if you want to improve people's health is fundamentally change the food in front of them. And the question of how do you fundamentally change the way that government works is a very challenging one and not one that I am going to remotely try and deal with. But maybe a sort of very small way that we can is by thinking about what those measures are. And I think maybe one thing that we can take away is how do we get more behavioural measures within public policy? So thinking about competition, for example, why are we asking companies to prove my thing is clear or sort of tick a box? Why aren't we just saying, actually, you need to measure whether people understand? And that seems to be coming through actually in very recent pension legislation, that pension providers will be required to prove that people understand their content. That would be something that we could do and we could spread much more widely. So I think maybe that's a sort of untapped opportunity we should be moving into.
Who is the George Lucas of behavioural public policy. It's a far out. He has a beard. And he has a trilogy that everyone thinks is great. And bonus, you can buy all 3 books for the price of 1 copy of my book, and I've only got the one, so it's an absolute bargain. In addition to being the George Lucas of behavioural public policy, he's also a professor of behavioural policy at the London School of Economics, which is a pretty good university quite near here, but you know, definitely the second best university within a quarter of a mile of where we are, because UCL is also within a quarter of a mile. Adam.
I'm glad Lucy's already here, otherwise I'd find this quite intimidating, so sitting here. before I start, I do want to congratulate Michael, Syon, I hope I get the pronunciations right, and Shibeal. I think I've only had a chance to skim this book, but it's a real tremendous effort that they've put in here. I mean, I have experience of editing, and I know how much effort you must have put into this. And what I kind of like about it, one of the many things I like about it, is that it really takes seriously the notion that context matters. You know, when I'm teaching behavioural public policy, or behavioural economics, I try to tell my students really that what I think is the two-word essence is that context matters. And you've brought out so many different contexts through the different chapters going through this book. So I think it's a tremendous effort, and congratulations for that. Like Lucy, I was asked by Michael, I think, to talk about my perspective of what I think there's a future of behavioural public policy going forward from here. I mean, obviously, Lucy's tackling this more from a policies perspective. I'm coming at this probably more from an academic, my perspective as an academic perspective, so to speak. So that's my brief that I'm going to talk about for 5 minutes or so here. Now, at this point in time, I sense that there's a real sort of watershed moment in behavioural public policy. Over the last 10 or 15 years now or so, the emphasis largely, and I think it's still the emphasis in policy actually, is that, effectiveness, what works, to coin a phrase. And I think that's probably what politicians are most concerned about. But within the sort of academic space, the watershed moment, I think now, is that we're kind of not moving beyond what works, of course, but there's much more emphasis on what is appropriate. What ought policymakers be doing with this sort of stuff? And that, if you take that sort of question seriously, that kind of, it comes before the effectiveness stuff, really, right? If a policy intervention, it can be tremendously effective, but if you think that it's not appropriate, it doesn't matter how effective it is, really. So that's, seems to me to be what's really being emphasised at the moment. I'm going to read out a quote from David Halpern in a moment, just a small one, that comes in the preface of Michael's book. Before I do that, I do want to emphasise, though, that I believe, as Michael does in his beautiful acknowledgement of David Halpern's efforts in his own introduction, is that David is one of the most important people, I think, in the world in the development of behavioural public policy. Him and Gus O'Donnell were, instrumental in the whole field, internationally, I think, of behavioural public policy, along with others, of course. But I just want to emphasise that I do think that David is a tremendously important figure in behavioural public policy and the history of it. I'm going to read out his quote. I say it, because I'm going to sort of push back a little bit against something that he said. But in his preface to Michael's book, Michael et al.'s book, he said, I quote, "I've lost count of the number of articles about behavioural insights research that fits the hedgehog account." Hedgehog meaning people with kind of one big idea, and foxes, people with lots and lots of different little smaller ideas, I think. And David prefers foxes over hedgehogs. Right. Continue the quote. "Perhaps most common is the attack on nudges. First define nudging, and by implication behavioural insights, as narrowly as possible. Exclude from the definition regulation, incentives, and as many other angles you can think of. Second, highlight how such a narrow lever is doomed to be able to fix many problems. Third, dismiss the field. Really, do we have to do this?" Right, so it seems to me that David is critical of people that try to work out, what are the specific definitions underpinning nudges there. I myself think that that's very, very important for the field and has been lost. I think definitions around the different frameworks in behavioural public policy are important, and that there's been a loosening of those definitions, to me, has led to a lot of loss in intellectual clarity around what we're doing. I think implicit in David's quote here is I think the truth that most people almost equate nudging with behavioural public policy, right? Now, if you look at the definitions of nudging that I have done, and if you look at what Thaler and Sunstein meant in their original writings on nudging, it was proposed as a paternalistic instrument, really, a paternalistic framework, right? Soft paternalism, libertarian paternalism. And what paternalism means is that you try to change people's behaviours, if we're thinking about behaviour change, such that their new behaviours are better for those individuals themselves, right? Now, there's a lot of people working in the behavioural public policy space, myself included, that are at least sceptical and in some cases vehemently opposed to paternalistic instruments, right? But that doesn't mean that we dismiss behavioural public policy or other frameworks in behavioural public policy. Of course not. I've spent my career working on these things, right? But we think that there's other more appropriate ways in which to use behavioural science in policy. One of those might be regulation, right? We regulate against possible externalities. So you could probably think about it yourself, but there are sort of thousands of examples you could think of where there's certain interests, through self-interest, use implicitly and sometimes explicitly the findings from behavioural science to get people to do stuff that's not necessarily good for those people, could harm those people in fact, but is good for the people that are manipulating those people. These, I think, are the targets that we should be thinking about when we use behavioural science in policy. And the Behavioural Insights Team actually do this a lot, right? Think about the online gambling industry. Do we need to regulate their activities in some instances because they're potentially harming other people through their manipulations? Possibly. We need to think about that, right? That's one approach. It's called budging, right? Not nudging. Another approach, I think, that does have... I'm just going to finish on this because I know I don't have much time. But the other approach that the one Lucy mentioned, actually... no, not Lucy. I think one of the previous speakers was boosting. So boosting is trying to educate people... one aspect of boosting is trying to educate people about the findings of behavioural science such that people can use their own agency. They can make their own decisions, right, when they think that they may be inappropriately being influenced by behavioural science, such that they then can modify their own decisions and choices to account for that if they don't want to be so manipulated. There's a related approach called Nudge Plus, actually, that's associated very strongly with Peter John, who's at King's College. But I won't talk about that today. But both of these approaches, I think, are about trying to improve individual agency, about giving the people tools to make their own more informed decisions for themselves. I'll finish at that point, Michael, because I know that I've not got much time today. But again, congratulations on your book.
Who is a PhD candidate also at the university just up the road and is a former vice president of the Busara Center, which is what one of the chapters is about. So she's a chapter author as well as being those amazing things. So, Anisha, over to you.
Also glad to be joining others.
Want some water?
Yes, please, that would be great. Thank you. So, hi everyone. Thank you to Michael, Syon, and Shibeal for not only giving us the opportunity to contribute a chapter to this fantastic collection, but also being here to celebrate the book launch with you. I'll maybe end on the note that Lucy and Adam spoke about the future of behavioral science as it is, but I'll take you through a little bit of what we have in the chapter itself and some lessons that we've learned along the way. So because we're a bit further away from London, I can give a little bit of an introduction to Busara as well, if that's helpful. So at the time of writing this chapter, I was the vice president with Busara. We're headquartered in Nairobi in Kenya, and we work a lot in those regions of sub-Saharan Africa, South America, and Asia. We're a social mission-driven nonprofit. We work both on the academic and on the applied side, and we've worked across maybe 30 countries looking at a variety of questions. So our work spans agriculture, individual and public health, financial inclusion, good governance, gender, etc. And some of the challenges that we look at are how do you increase, let's say, agricultural insurance for smallholder farmers, or how do you increase the adoption for iron and folic acid tablets for pregnant women in India? How do you increase attendance to community meetings in Uganda? How do you develop a long-acting HIV prevention product? So that's sort of the space that we operate in. What we did for the chapter was maybe one of the weirder chapters that you'll come across in the book, but we wrote a series of faxes from our present self to our past self, reflecting on the things that we did wrong or that we've learned from, and some of the successes as well. So I thought in talking about the future of the space, it's also useful to share maybe a little bit of what we've learned so far. So in terms of what's worked for us, or maybe I can start with in terms of what hasn't worked for us, and going back to what Michael was saying in the beginning, we really set up in 2015 following the sort of bread and butter behavioral science models that were pioneered by Nudge and BIT, and we've sort of had to really contend with the fact whether those models work in the global south. So reflecting on maybe 500 projects that we've done so far, we find we've actually done very little nudging, way more research, probably much less experimentation, less causal evaluations, and more capacity building than we would have predicted ex ante. And we had gone into this very much trying to do similar approaches, but in the global south. And of course, there's a whole lot of reasons for that, and the one that we think has really pushed it, and the one that the book really focuses on, is the importance of context and how important it is to really work within the regions you are and for the communities you're serving. So I think on the positive of something that's really worked for us is sort of being committed to this idea of disrupting norms around representation, about local talent and pushing local talent forward, and working for those and with those in the communities we work in. I think the other one that's been a really positive shift is sort of increasing investment in qualitative research and design, which was also maybe more demand-driven for us in the countries we work, but it's really brought a richness to our advisory that we can push forward. And I think now as the field is sort of diluting from a behavioral economics, we've come to behavioral science, there's sort of a future at the intersection of all of these that at least we see. And what I thought I would end with is share more on what we've learned doing all of this. And having said that, I think the one cliche that holds true for us is that the only constant through all of these and through the field's evolution itself is sort of that change is the only constant. And while we talk about what the future might hold for the field, there are some guiding principles that at least we're taking with us, we talk about in the book. And those are to sort of commit to disrupting these representation norms, commit to talent and the people within those contexts that you work, recognize how dynamic the field is. And we've had to be sort of open to evaluating ourselves as well, not just the products and policies that we design. And finally, to be bold and like fail as often as we can and iterate despite those failures, not because of them. So in the chapter, we have a lot of stories of the many times we failed and many warnings and many lessons. So I hope you enjoy reading that along with obviously the other brilliant chapters as well. So congratulations.
Okay, having successfully gotten to the stage without tripping over and killing myself, which is always a risk, does anybody have any questions? I think we've got a good amount of time. I would remind people that questions are one sentence long and end in a question mark. If not, you can start with the diatribes. Any questions? Lady there. I think a microphone is incoming.
You touched on paternalism in the opening, and I guess one thing I've been thinking about lately is, you know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, there was consensus on what is good for people. And I think what we're seeing now with, I guess, the culture wars, and is this maybe less of an agreement on that, and how do we accommodate that? I'm thinking a little bit about some of the stuff that's happening in public transport or in congestion charges, and how, you know, that previously the idea that if we could slow people down, if we could move people away from cars and towards public transport, it would make a significant impact towards climate change. And now we're seeing kind of a pushback that, you know, is the car perhaps sacred, and less agreement on that. So I guess when it's not as clear when society is not in agreement on what the right direction is, how should we approach that from a behavioural perspective?
So I might go to Adam first. Or I can vamp for a minute while you consider.
No, I can kick off, I suppose. You won't remember what I've said for very long, so it doesn't matter if I what I say, really, does it? I mean, I think you have to be very careful about the definition of paternalism, which is something that I've been sort of hope everybody can hear me, but it's something I've written about a lot over the years. So just to reiterate, you know, those of us who are, say, anti-paternalists, let's say, we don't support the notion that governments or anybody can try to influence other people's behaviours for their own good. To me, that seems to suggest that there's a huge amount of confidence that, say, a policymaker knows what's good for the person themselves, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't think that policymakers shouldn't intervene. Of course, you know, for me, for instance, when there are externalities, if people are causing harms to other people, then you know, then that's fair game, really, for policymakers to intervene in that potentially. So going to your question, do we think that there's less confidence? I don't know. I mean, maybe others can answer this better than I can, but my perspective, at least within the field of behavioural public policy, as I said a moment ago, I think that within the academic field, I think there's more and more people involved now and starting to question about that sort of paternalistic vision, really, for all sorts of reasons. You know, I don't have time to go into the reasons here of why the policymaker themselves might not be the best judge of what's good for each individual person. But there are all sorts of reasons why we might argue that. You know, all of us here, everybody in this room has their own sort of various and varied objectives for their own life, right? So is it really possible for an intervention to be introduced at a general level that moves people in the directions that those people want to go in themselves, given that everybody has their own multifarious and varied desires in life? So I guess I'll finish at that point because I think I'm hogging too much space and others can
Never, Adam.
Yeah.
So at the risk of also hogging too much space, I think, so there is a great deal of oxygen is expended on the current culture wars. I think it's possibly a mistake to view the past as a place in which there was wonderful consensus and everybody was wonderfully progressive. So back in the New Labour days, there was before we had the new system where things get debated in Parliament thanks to the coalition government, we had a petition site, a number 10 petition site, where you could petition number 10. And the most popular petition on that had 1.8 million signatures. So this was a thing that was live from about 1988 until the coalition came in. Does anyone want to guess what 1.8 million people were against? People say it's the Iraq War. That was the second most popular with 1 million people. The most popular was 80% more popular than that, and that was no to road pricing. So it's not as though people have hated the car and now they're falling in love with it again. I think that's worth mentioning. When the congestion charge came in, it was so unpopular. And now, even the Prime Minister is not talking about getting rid of that, right? We're talking about changing ULEZ. We're not talking about let's get rid of the congestion charge. There's also, other areas of policy making. We have seen movement, right? So 25, 30 years ago, you were living in a country where teachers were not allowed to teach about homosexuality being good or being natural. We now live in a country where they can and where gay marriage is legal and was brought through obviously by a coalition government, one part of which was Conservative. When I was growing up, the idea that you would ban cigarettes, you would say no one's allowed to smoke, would have been viewed as this outrageous quasi-communist idea, right? Adam and his friends who like liberalism would be taking to the streets.
Well, not quite. I'm not that bothered about it.
No. The 30-year-old version of Adam's obviously much too young to have been around 30 years ago. We've seen a Conservative Prime Minister announce a banning of smoking, obviously progressive, gradual, but a banning of smoking as part of his conference speech, and it wasn't the big thing he announced, right? The big thing he announced was we're not going to have a train, but, So there is a surprising amount of consensus about a surprising amount of thing, and I think we should try to avoid the confected anger produced by some members of the Prime Minister's party, which make us think that there's much more division than there actually is. But, as Adam says, there are obviously areas where we should continue to have debates about what is the right role for the state. Colleagues, anybody want to?
Yeah, I can come in with three. I've got three sort of cop-out responses. So I'll just take as given, there is division. I think I sit with Michael on it's probably escalating a lot less than it appears to be. Maybe it's not escalating at all, but it's definitely there, and it still raises the question: what do you do? How do you decide what behaviours to promote when there isn't clear agreement on that? And the sort of first cop-out response is that thankfully it's not our job. So, you know, when we go and we meet with policymakers and they say, we need to make, you know, how do we get people to do X? Occasionally we challenge them on, maybe that isn't what you want to do, but broadly speaking, they're going to find other ways of getting people to try to do X anyway, so we might as well try and make it effective and more choice preserving and everything like that. So I think it's broadly, somebody tells us what they want to achieve and bar us going, that's an absolutely horrendous idea, we're just not going anywhere near it, we kind of take as read that that is something that we're moving towards. So delegate decision making is my first sort of cop out. I think the second one is choice preserving. So insofar as you can keep things that give people optionality, I think that's why I'm so sort of obsessed with this idea of allowing people to choose if they want their payments weekly on universal credit. Like, there's nobody that can disagree with just saying that's a choice that you should allow within the system. And the third one, I think, is around how do you get that consensus. So I think that's something that is growing in popularity but somewhat untapped right now, which is kind of how do we bring people together for participatory methods, but also particularly with a really clear structure towards them. So sort of citizens assembly style things where you actually have enough of a kind of deep process and enough of a random sample from across the UK to actually say, we have gone out to people, we have really informed them, and there will be people that disagree with it, but we have enough of a consensus that we can start to design policy and say, actually, broadly, across the UK, people think this. And I think that also gives us hopefully, could give us a bit more stability in policy making, because it's much harder then to back down from it when there has been that very much public consensus agreed.
I can add on quickly to Lucy's last point. I think if I think of your question, but in a sort of different domain, I think there is, to your third point, this sort of co-creation is very important, right? In terms of, I know some parts of Kenya, for example, the counties have, I think they call it like collective budgeting processes, where you can deliberate, community members participate, and then they sort of set priorities and agendas for what is important for policymakers. So I think all to say, like, there are so many questions that are ambiguous, and it's hard to know that there is one particular behavior that we need to promote. I think the shift that, from where I sit, is required is to sort of involve more community members and the populations that are affected into the decision-making processes itself, so that the voices are not just of those in power, but it sort of is a good representation as such. So.
Person sitting behind George, which may be nothing to the person with the microphone.
Thank you for your wonderful insights that you've all been sharing to all of you three panelists. I noticed a common theme through many of the applications of BI that you were sharing. They're nudging or applying behavioural science to individuals or downstream of policy making. I was wanting to ask all three of the panelists, where are the opportunities you might see to apply behavioural science more upstream in the policy process? Perhaps nudging institutions, organisations, or creating systematic change? And where do you think there might be opportunities for that in the future? Thank you.
He said three, so he doesn't want to hear from me.
I think it was me that he done. I think it was Mark, because you can't see me.
I can go first with one top of my head. It's only because I've taken a career shift into start doing this more, so I can share that. I think there is a big debate, right, between like I-frame and S-frame interventions, and where the future lies and what that meso level even looks like, if there's a level between I and S. But I do think one area maybe that's overlooked, maybe less in the policy in the traditional sense, but is definitely in how workplaces are constructed and how workplace design itself can sort of then be well-being promoting for the individuals who are part of it, given the growing worker population across the globe. So I think there are more upstream potentials there to think about how in the way certain workplace policies are set up, how do we then deal with whatever sort of penalties you might think of that employees experience, whether it's burnout or gender-related or other sorts.
Yeah, I mean, Anish has touched upon the. How many of you are familiar with the I-frame versus S-frame paper by George Lowenstein and Nick Chater, which, for some reason, it's well, this a little perplexing to me, created such huge controversy within the field of behavioural public policy.
Only because they dramatically misrepresented the work done by behavioural
Well,
scientists.
yeah, I know that you've.
Other than that, there's no
I know
good
that
reason.
you've been a little bit like that, but I think that I think that their main message, though, really, to me, when I read their stuff, is that they're arguing similar to the point that you're making, really, it seems to me, is that there's been too much, according to them, focus upon individual behaviours in the field, and they accuse themselves of doing that as well, because they themselves are two of the leading behavioural scientists working in this space. And the way that I read the paper is that they were just calling for more emphasis on the supply side, if you like, or on structures. And to me, I think that's. I mean, I'm not against. For me, I'm not against focusing on the individual as long as it's looking at sort of externalities rather than internalities. But to me, it seems as though if you are going to really substantively tackle or aim to tackle many of the major challenges that contemporary societies face, whether that be climate change or obesity or misinformation or all of these sorts of things, then it seems to me as though you probably do have to tackle structures more so than individual behaviours. That's where you're going to have your real effect. So I think that your question sort of alludes to the point I was trying to make, that there's this watershed moment. Where is it most appropriate to use this sort of stuff? And these guys, the Behavioural Insights Team with Lucy and her colleagues, I know that they're doing that already. I think that just the whole thing's become confused by these poor definitions around the different frameworks in behavioural public policy. And if we'd had these very strict definitions of frameworks that we'd have stuck to over the course of time, we wouldn't be having all this kind of confusion that's going on within this space now.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, I think I very much sit with Nisha, which is that what you need to do is change the systems. And I think probably in general, I am more skeptical than Adam that you can teach people about their biases and then they help to avoid them in the future. But I do think that what you can do is at an organisational level, teach people how biases work and then convince them to change the systems. So I actually think that's you want that level of understanding and then go, this isn't going to help you unless you actually fundamentally put something into practice. So I think there's just a sort of communication step-by-step approach to changing organisational behaviour that should be pretty important. And then I think the second is looking at these things at the policy level. In some ways, sometimes the system level stuff is actually more rational, which gives you some sort of new levers that you can play with. I mean, I'm going to sound like an absolute broken record, but on the sugar tax stuff, I mean, we talk about it as behavioural, but actually the after effect that was behavioural. The tax just worked like a pure incentive where companies acted completely rationally in order to deal with it. So I think there's that sort of, that lens as well, like there are just basic incentive things that we can be doing, but we might be thinking about them in a slightly different way from those without a behavioural background.
Can I just pop in and say, I'm sceptical as well, that you can teach people and they can use these things. It's just that conceptually it's acceptable for me because you preserve their agency. But I am scared. I would still go for like sort of regulating the supply side rather than,
There's a clutch of hands in there. I will defer to the gentleman with the microphone as to who goes first.
Yes, thank you. So, two things. First, we experienced a bit of difficulty hearing you, Adam. So maybe you could sit closer to the mic. Sorry. That would be great.
Well, that might be to your advantage.
I hope not. But thank you. And then the second thing is a question that is sort of a follow-up on the I versus S framework. They sort of imply that we maybe should move away then from RCTs. And you already mentioned before that maybe we should move more towards using quasi-experimental methods. Do you think that that is where the field should go?
I hadn't really thought about that, using RCTs on the supply side. Is that something that's done? Or?
So, I mean, there are a lot of people who say we should move upstream, we should start thinking about structures, we should start thinking about systems, and that means because we can't randomize structures, we should move away from randomized control trials. I'm skeptical of that as an approach on the basis that I do not think our science is strong enough to say we can move away from randomized control trials. If we look at the academic discipline from which we are drawing our insights, even the parts of it which are not corrupted by p-hacking and fraud, they are largely the study of pro-socially motivated American undergraduates who are not representative of all people everywhere. We therefore cannot make a leap from this is a thing that works in a really great paper in psychological science to, and so we should change the tax system, or so we should change the way that we regulate the world. We need to be, and I think it's appropriate for us to be humble about what it is that we know about human behavior in a scientific way. In order to make that leap to, we're going to do these big things, then I think we need to improve the quality of our science before we get there. I appreciate that is decidedly unsexy. It means you basically can't tackle climate change because climate change is a structural problem, but climate change is also not a behavioral problem. Right? No. If we change where we get our energy from, building nuclear power stations or whatever you want to do, that will fix a large portion of the problems, much more than convincing people to turn the lights off when they leave rooms. Right? This is, and in that sense, I agree with, perhaps not with Nick and George, but with people who say that behavioral science can be a distraction. So I don't think we should move away from RCTs because I don't think our science is good enough. I can say, the most important paper for me in the history of microeconomics is the Carden-Kruger evaluation of the effects of the minimum wage. That is a quasi-experimental study, and it's enormously impactful and important. We couldn't do an RCT for that, so they have to do QED. But we shouldn't say, I'm bored of doing RCTs. RCTs are hard. I keep getting null results. I'm going to move up to a slightly less rigorous method and start playing with the lives of millions without regards for the consequences.
Maybe I'll come in. I mean, I don't disagree with you. I feel very different about that question depending on who raises it and who, conscious of that. So, like, if Michael comes to me and says, I don't think we should be doing an RCT in this context because I don't think it's feasible, but I think we can get better data out of it doing it like this, I go, great, I'm totally with you, let's run with it. Because I know that he cares deeply about causal methods. He knows heaps about them. And if he's saying, right now, this is not the best methodology to be using because we can get better data from this or it would curtail what we're trying to do too much, then I totally trust him. Whereas if somebody who's not very adept on RCTs comes to me and goes, I don't know if this is really an RCT space, I kind of roll my eyes and leave the room as politely as possible. So I broadly think, yes, there are times that an RCT isn't appropriate, and we also mean, I think, as we get more sophisticated with it, RCT in quite a broad sense. So we're definitely looking at permutations on it and clustering and everything like that, and maybe not, classic individually randomized RCT that many other people will be thinking about. I think there are plenty of moments where it is appropriate to use different forms of evaluation. I just get worried when I think it's coming from a place that says, actually, we don't really buy the results of doing things robustly in the first place. And I think the only other thing I'd say is I think it is very important that we never stop doing RCTs on at least a big chunk of our stuff, because it's an incredibly good way of keeping our own arrogance in check. I have run a lot of interventions that I thought were brilliant and have turned out not to be. And it's the biggest slap in the face you can get for your own intelligence. And I think if we start doing things at a policy level, saying we can't evaluate robustly, and never doing things that allow us to realize that most of the time we're wrong, then we're going to be, making kind of wild claims that we can't back up. So I think it's important that we keep learning from that rigor in any way that we can as well.
I think crucially is we should be doing the things that are hard, right? Whether that's an RCT, whether that's a QED, whether it's dealing with something structural, we have to avoid taking the easy way out, because that way we will not progress and we will not have the impact that we all hope that we would have as a movement. I might go to the next question, the person with the headphones.
Thank you very much for your insights. Okay, now it is. Sorry about that. Thank you for your insights. I had a question about boosts because I know that's quite a controversial topic and their efficacy or really just examples in practice are very limited. So what would you say are the most feasible areas or area that you think they could work in? Do you see a future in boosts?
Feasible areas? What do you mean in terms of frameworks or in terms of target? Areas of application. I'm going to leave the areas of application to you guys, I think, because it depends upon what you want to, target, really, isn't it? I mean, do you want to still target the low-hanging fruit, as Lucy pointed out, or do you want to try to tackle the big, more structural problems? I mean, probably it's going to be a mix of all of these things, isn't it? I would think. Do I see a future in boosts? I think there is a future in boosts. I mean, boosts are, I think, if you listen to Gerd Gigerenzer, then boosts are the most prominent form of behavioural public policy intervention in Germany. And that's what, according to Gerd, the German government use. As Lucy said, with boosts, it does require a lot of confidence that requires you to be very confident that people themselves, general people in the public, the general public can learn about the findings from behavioural science and then act upon those themselves to modify their own behaviours. It requires them to learn various sort of simple statistical rules that would perhaps help them make a more reasoned decision when they're making a financial investment or when they're deciding on a particular medical treatment, those sorts of things. And that, to me, does require a huge amount of, I'd say, overconfidence that people can sort of, the general public generally can act upon these sorts of things in those ways. But I do think there's a future in boosts, but I just think that it's probably going to be a relatively sort of a marginal impact upon people's behaviours as they go into the future.
I could give what might sound like a cop-out answer, but I would say it depends. And I would say that for the RCT question as well. I think one thing that the field, in my opinion, has struggled with is like throwing these things as solutions, right? Like there's a problem, RCT. There's a problem, nudge. There's a problem, boost. And that's sort of where it then doesn't work out. I think it's really upon, maybe to Lucy's point, to us to be thoughtful, researchers, evaluators, policymakers, to see what really suits the question at play, and then determine which tool or which option or which approach actually makes sense. I think we've, for many years, come with there are 6 options and we're going to throw each of them in succession and see which one works, and that's sort of not the way that I see for the future.
Yeah. So I think we don't have to go as far as Adam is saying in terms of being arrogant about our ability to influence the general public. I think we can, as Kahneman and Tversky would do, right, we could look at ourselves, right? So who in here, and you can just do it in your heads, but like, who over the last week has bought something that they perhaps shouldn't have done because it was on discount? Right? You've come to an event at a university about nudging. Many of you will have studied behavioral science. You still fell for that one. The idea that we're going to systematically indoctrinate the population against being essentially marketed at and falling into psychological fallacies seems very unlikely. And we also have to bear in mind that we are not doing this in a vacuum, right? There are opposing forces who want people to make dumb decisions because that's how they make their money. And they have got tons of money and tons of resources. So I just don't think we're going to boost our way out of very many problems. Another question is a person in the second row back.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful talk. My question would be related to universal basic income because this topic is extremely fascinating, and also like what would be the behavioral aspects or implications of it. The one thing that I could think of is change in reference point and the role of hyperbolic or quasi-hyperbolic discounting in terms of consumption and savings. But apart from that, can you enlighten me on this?
Do you want me to kick off again?
This
not literally kick off.
Stop.
There's a.
What does your liberalism say about UBI?
No. This is my don't misinterpret my liberalism, right?
I'm asking
you have to
what
hear
you're
it from the horse's mouth. You've got are you at King's? Are you at King's? Oh, you're at, let's say, oh, well, very, well, what are you doing here for? You no, I'm kidding, I love King's. There's a scholar, there's a professor in the political economy department at King's called Syon Hargreaves-Heap, and he is a behavioural public policy person, prominent one as well. And he argues, and I think convincingly, I agree with it as well, I suppose I agree with it, is that if you're looking at whether people, I mean, it's an old point really, but it's been used in behavioural public policy. If you are wanting people to be, to act upon their own autonomy to the best of their abilities, and this is a theme that runs through behavioural public policy these days at an academic level. If you want people to be able to, exploit their own agency, if you like, to be act as the best of their abilities on, with their own decision making, then it's likely that people need a particular level of what we might categorise as primary goods, foundational goods, right? One of those could be a decent level of health, going back to sort of Amartya Sen's arguments, I suppose. Another could be, J.S. Mill argued that people needed to be, have a basic level of education in order to function reasonably in society. And one of those could be a basic level of income as well, right? So you might need these basic levels of various primary goods that are foundational for people to act upon their own agency. This is an important theme running through behavioural public policy these days. So I think that that's possibly where you could make the argument that a universal basic income could possibly serve those purposes. Syon Hargreaves-Heap, professor at King's, would argue that. And there are other scholars throughout history, liberal scholars, mind you, liberal scholars, that argue the same. So where, just as a footnote, and then I'll shut up, where Michael and many others, including people in my own department, and I'm in the Department of Social Policy at the LSE, which is traditionally quite a left-wing department, where they often mischaracterise me and other liberals is that they place us in a libertarian camp. We're not libertarians, we're liberals, right? And liberals, from my perspective, can believe in profound interventions by the state, including interventions that address externalities. I would argue probably more profound than paternalistic interventions, and more ethically defensible as well. So, just to put you straight there.
Yeah,
right,
thank you.
right.
So to take a slightly more, I mean, as somebody who is more paternalistic than Adam, because almost everyone is, the state is very bad at lots of things, right? You just have to go back to the pandemic where we were spending 20 quid to give kids half a pepper and a carrot for lunch because that was the inefficiency with which government was able to spend money on food. The two things that the state is pretty good at, actually, are taking money away from people and giving money to people, right? It's fairly straightforward. We have most of the processes in place. We managed to roll out, Tim Loenig is an absolute genius, but we rolled out furlough in about 15 seconds because there were very smart people working on it, but also because we've got the mechanisms to give people money and we've got the mechanisms to take money away from people. The simplest way of doing public policy in that space is something like a universal basic income. If you want to talk about behavioural science, we can talk about Sundar-Lanathan, Eldar Shafir, we can talk about scarcity, we can talk about all of that stuff. I don't think this is a behavioural question. It's giving people money. This is an economic question for me. And I don't even think it's an economic question, despite the fact that I'm an economist. This is also a moral question. It's about preserving and creating human dignity and allowing people to have that autonomy that not just liberals, but I think most people in a liberal democratic society should hold dear. Right? Our people's ability to contribute to our society is based on them having dignity and autonomy. And if we can provide that through universal basic income, which is an if, then I feel like we should do it. At King's, because I am not a theorist, I'm an empiricist, we have 4 randomized control trials and 1 quasi-experimental evaluation of cash transfers programs in the UK at the moment, because we're trying to find out, does it make a difference, particularly for young people who have experienced children's social care, because that's one of my other pet things that I care about. But, and we will wait to see what the results say, because, if the results say it doesn't actually make any difference, then I have to change my view, because that's what being an empiricist means. But in principle, this isn't about behavioral economics or economics. This is about morality and dignity. Harry.
Oh, yeah.
Microphone, Harry. Wait.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Hi. Yeah, just based on all the looking around the world that you did, you and Syon did for your book, and I guess to all the other panelists as well. I'd love to hear about a scheme or an intervention that you came across as you kind of looked all around the globe, which you would love to see tried or deployed in this country.
Well, I'm going first because I read all the chapters. So I think one of the things that comes across in a number of chapters in the book is around this, it's not an intervention, so this is a cop-out, but everyone else has been allowed a cop-out, so I'm having one. It's not about an intervention per se, it's about a way of arriving at the intervention, which is where you devolve that decision-making. You have either citizens' assemblies, or you have a more democratic process, or something that involves co-creation, so that the intervention, the policy you're devising is much more done with rather than done to, and is centered in the idea that the people who you're doing it to should want the outcome that you're trying to push them towards. And in a number of different teams and a number of different chapters in the book, we see that people have made a real effort to do that. And I think in this country, not just in the nudge space and policy making generally, we are not very good at that. We are very good at talking about it. We're very good at saying, we're going to do co-design. We're going to get 4 social workers in, and we're going to give them some coffee, and we're going to talk to them for an hour, and then we've co-designed it. But we're going to invite in, Nimal and 3 of her mates, because I know they're going to give me the answer I want because they quite like me and they share my values and views. We're very good at talking about it. We're much less good at doing it, and I would love us to be much better, but I don't know how we get there.
Where did you see it being done brilliantly somewhere else?
There's a few different chapters. I will look them up and come back to you.
I'm trying to think of like a really neat intervention. So I spent a couple of years working in Singapore, which just...
Favour turn?
The perennial question. We get asked every 6 months, how do you make people return their trays in hawker centres? And it's like the greatest minds in Singapore can't work this out. And to be honest, nor could we really. And now they're just whacking great fines on it. And it is kind of fascinating because there'll often be this question about like, how do you change behaviour? I remember there was one on, we're going to get people to register the e-scooters. And we thought, great, that's a classic area for behavioural science, right? Like, you're going to say that you need people to register, but how do you actually get them to do it? And they were like, oh, fine them $2,000 if they don't. And we were like, maybe that will work. Maybe you don't need a nudge. So they have a different sort of lens of looking at things. It's not specifically one intervention. I think I am fascinated by just their completely different lens on these things, but it does come from a sort of very behavioural standpoint. So the housing system is amazing. It's like 80% state built and everything. They also have something that you could never do here, and I don't think you should, but does lead to fascinating consequences, which is around so for all the state-built housing, they have racial quotas, because everybody in Singapore is classified by their ethnicity. Many reasons we're not going to do this. But it is about saying something which is like, we want people mixing within, we want to create neighbourhoods that are forcibly mixed because there is a real history of that sort of division. And we recognise that as important. So it's far too heavy-handed, but it is looking at something and going, how do you actually kind of create mixed communities and encourage people to mix? It then has this sort of fascinating side effect, which is, so there are huge differences in earnings across different racial groups in Singapore, one of the many issues. But if you are if you are Malay, you can get your rent a lot cheaper than if you were Chinese, because the only people who can rent that block are Malay. So it naturally adapts to the sort of incomes, which is weird on lots and lots of different levels. But yeah, they have a very interesting lens, albeit not one that we're going to replicate.
I mean, I can't sort of allude to anything in the books. I mean, I was just thinking, as the other guys were talking, and about sort of international experiences with various behavioural techniques that I come across. And I think one that's very interesting is the notion of reputational competition that we do have a little bit in this country sometimes. So I'll give one example is in Italy, where, if I get this right, my colleague Gwyn Bevan has written a lot about this, is that the different regions can have a lot of autonomy about how they organise their healthcare systems in there, and how they raise finances for their healthcare systems as well regionally in Italy. But they've implemented across the regions, it's almost like, it looks like a dartboard, and it basically indicates how well each region is doing on various healthcare indicators. And then these dartboards are sort of publicised, on a yearly basis or something like that. And what's been shown after the introduction of this kind of reputational competition, it comes with no promise of any increase in finances, is that the regions start to perform a lot better because they're comparing themselves with, neighbouring regions and thinking, I want to outdo that particular region. So it strikes me as though we could do a lot more around reputational competition in the UK, at least in theory, in this country, across a whole range of public sectors. I suppose politically there might be an obstacle in that some of our public services are so heavily centralised, aren't they? And it might be more difficult politically, I suppose, for the regions to experiment with raising their own finances or with, just basically experimenting about, over the management of their services. But I think it fits in with J.S. Mill's arguments again about experiments in living in some sense. You let different regions experiment and then they can potentially learn from each other as well. So that's what I have there. Yeah.
Also don't have something specific, but what's coming to my mind is more on this idea of, so it's hard for me to say that we should borrow, we should take an idea from somewhere else, and maybe that has applications in the UK, precisely because the flip is usually what happens, and that's what I worked for many years trying to flip that script a bit. But I think the one thing that does come to mind is that from what I can see in the UK, there's a lot of categorization. Let's say if I know your political leaning, we can make 6 predictions about which way apparently Adam is going to lean, even though I didn't know Adam before this, if he's liberal
Michael
or
already
not.
knows which way he is, so he made it very clear.
Exactly. But I think what that leaves space for and is sort of you never uncover what you don't know, right? And I think there's a larger movement in global south countries now to sort of try to uncover these unknown unknowns, and going to maybe what Michael said before, sort of starting with a very qualitative approach to figuring out what is important to people in those regions. So an example I can come up with, which I don't think is from the book, is in West Africa, this notion of enemyship is extremely important. So we could be friends, but you could still be my enemy, which is not something you might think of studying in the UK, but it's very prevalent in West Africa. So I wonder, with these easy categorizations and predictability of what comes with, if we're really missing things on the nuance of which way people actually lean and in thinking about policy in this country.
I stupidly haven't bought anything which allows me to tell the time up here, so I'm going to look at George, and George is going to tell me if I have time for one more question. George says one more question. George is all-powerful. There's a person at the back over there.
Hello. I thought I might ask for some examples for government policy that have actively ignored behavioural advice.
I think the main problem is they don't ask for it in the first place.
Yeah. So, I think from my relatively brief time in government, the biggest thing is what I would call the "you're not as cool as you think you are" effect, which is I have spent 6 months developing this policy. I know every damn thing about it, and when we release it, the public are going to find it really interesting and definitely take it up. And we've seen with the Green Deal, or the Green Deal, what was it called?
Green Belt.
What's the Green Deal? Yeah, sorry, see now. The Green Deal, where the government's like, we're going to subsidise people to get heat pumps and solar panels and insulation and all of that kind of stuff, and it was way too complicated, and the number of people who took up this multi-billion-pound government programme is, I have about the right number of fingers, right? So complete failure because you're not as cool as you think you are. And I think there's a whole bunch of different policy areas where, not you personally, I'm sure you're exactly as cool as you think you are, cooler possibly even, but this idea that government constantly thinks that the public are going to pay way more attention to their complicated and detailed policy than they actually are. And a lot of policies fail for exactly that reason. And then the flip of that, which is my favourite example of government failure, because it was when I was 2 months into being in Cabinet Office and I got dragged in from my working from home day, which was unusual because it was 2012, to deal with it was, but it's basically people will pay more attention to the thing you don't want them to pay attention to. So Francis Maude, who was previously a cabinet minister, he's now Lord Maude, which is nice because it rhymes. He went on the radio because there was a threat of a strike by the people who deliver all of our petrol, and he said, and he was asked, Minister, what are you doing to negotiate? Yada yada yada. And to be clear, at this point, there hadn't been a vote on whether to have a strike or not, and because of the way strike rules work in this country since the 1980s, like that means you can't have a strike really for about 3 or 4 months. And he said, don't panic. Like, if you're worried, maybe get a jerry can and fill it up with petrol at home. And in response to the 2 words, don't panic, everybody panicked. And so in the absence of a fuel strike, so in the absence of a genuine shortage, we ran out of petrol within 5 days. So the twin lessons are, your complicated policy isn't as cool as you think it is, and if you say exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment, you can bring the whole house of cards down, and that becomes everything the government's about for the next week.
Why did you ask that question?
Curiosity.
What
That is a good reason to ask questions.
You're a behavioural skeptic then, is that why?
Oh, no, not quite the opposite.
Oh, okay.
Genuinely. I thought I might get a fun story out of it.
Sorry to disappoint. Anybody got a fun story?
No, I don't think I've got one where they just said, we're not going to do that. But most of the time, if they don't want to listen to you, they don't invite you to speak to them in the first place. It's my experience.
Universal credit must be taken. I told you about that. DWP.
I was going to say, I thought somebody might have flagged it, but sadly it was before my time. But I'm glad to hear somebody did.
Anna
even if
Salas,
they didn't
everyone.
listen.
Anna has fun stories. They get funner with wine, I'm told. Anyway, any other examples that we've got of times when people ignored advice? We've got everyone listens to all of their advice all the time. On which note, I will draw us to a close and say thank you ever so much for all of you for being here and for listening, if you have been, and if you haven't been, then you can't hear me. And thank you for your questions, those of you who asked them, those of you who we weren't able to get to your questions, I'm terribly sorry. And can you please join me now in thanking our panellists for their wonderful contribution. Thank you. And I'm given to understand that there is wine.
So you're obviously.
Yeah, I joined the PhD program at PBS.
Who's your supervisor then?
Laura and Matthew, maybe you know.
No, no.